All right, okay. So I would like to welcome all of you to this session once again. I am so happy that we are meeting once a month and exploring this extremely powerful possibility, how altered states inform transformation. I think it's a very important topic. And then you also may have noticed as we are speaking in the US, some transformation is happening. If you noticed, that the psychedelic research is supported by the government, and then, as you know, that would mean many potential possibilities opening up, especially for those who are from the US. So congratulations, colleagues, those who are joining from US, and I think also when US takes a step like that, I think many other countries follow the US as what we have noticed. So I'm very excited for these emerging possibilities that are ahead of us. So let's get started. How altered states inform transformation. And today we are particularly looking at the foundations of psilocybin and the therapeutic potential. I think we cannot talk about therapeutic potential of anything unless we really understand it in depth. So today I have a very, very interesting topic. So in the previous two sessions, if we remember briefly, the first session we talk a lot about experiential aspects of psychedelics, the potential of it. And then during our next session, we discussed a lot about the mechanisms in our body, what type of systems are activated as we are going through a psychedelic experience from a larger, bigger picture. Of course, as we continue on to further discuss this topic, I very much look forward to diving deeper into how certain psychedelic compounds interact with our body and what is the therapeutic potential of it. So today, focusing on the foundations of therapeutic potential, I think it's something very important that we need to address is to understand a little bit about what are psychedelics, and also I think there are many misconceptions around psychedelics. There is still a lot of stigma. So really looking at the bigger picture, what are really psychedelics? What are some other elements that are associated with psychedelics, and also why psychedelic is illegal around the world and what is happening at the moment in the world. So we are going to open a window to understanding these elements. And I think it is very crucial as we discuss about psychedelic integration coaching and therapy. It's very important that we also understand how are these medicines perceived by our different parts of the world, and also governing bodies, policymakers, and what's the history about. So let's dive in. I think it's really very important to having that understanding. You may be a practitioner in this space as a professional coach, as a psychotherapist, maybe a psychedelic integration facilitator, or you may be simply interested in learning more about possibilities of transformation, or maybe you are curious in undertaking a deep healing journey or a transformation journey with these potential possibilities. So I welcome all of you. So if you are a clinician, if you have been particularly educated on this topic, you might find the information I'm sharing quite basic. But at the same time, the way how I praise them, if not how I frame them, and also how we look at it might be of value. So I invite you to engage with an open mind and an open heart. So let's, since we are going to, today particularly, we are going to look at certain different substances. So it's very important that we mention this session, this lecture series solely intended for education and harm reduction purposes and intended for 18 plus audiences. And our focus and our hope is this knowledge would enable us to move towards healing, enhancement, and transformation in our own lives. And as we discuss psychedelics healing possibilities, it is integral for us to discuss about certain mental disorders, mental conditions. Therefore, I invite you to engage with caution. So let's continue on and dive into our session. So before we do that, I would like to do a very quick recap very briefly so that we create the way forward by accumulating what we have been discussing so far. So we have discussed a little bit about how neurons work inside of our body within our nervous system. And we understood that there are chemical agents in our body, which we call neurochemicals, which enable for us to experience our world, ourselves, our relationships in a specific way, and they are directly connected to our emotions, our energy, and our behavior. So you may recall we discussed that when we work with most classic psychedelics, being the focus here, psilocybin being the focus here, we learned that the main system, the neurochemical system that psilocybin, if not magic mushrooms, interact with is serotonergic system. So the system that is responsible for regulating our body, mind, and the emotion. And with that, we keep in mind our focus here, key focus here is psilocybin. And in the upcoming sessions, I will be sharing with you why. What's the key difference between different classic hallucinogenic plant medicines, and why psilocybin is the key focus. In fact, if you even look at the legalization of psilocybin, you notice that, legalization of psychedelics, you notice that psilocybin is one of the common psychedelics that become legalized first. And I think one of the reasons we have already looked at, as we looked at the harm reduction index of different substances, and we noticed that psilocybin has is one of the least harmful substances, and even those harm index or the aspects of harm, we understand that it's actually the change of the neurological functioning and psychological functioning as we intake it, because we go into therapeutic mode if it is in the kept in the right set and setting. So, continuing on, you remember we discussed very briefly about the chemical compounds. And what is important to remember is that psilocin molecule is very similar to the serotonin molecule. Serotonin molecule, which being our regulatory neurochemical. And we learned that psilocin molecules can directly bind with 5-HT2A receptors. In other words, the serotonin receptors, and enable supersedes what usually serotonin does. It acts as a catalyst for deep introspection and change of perception, experiencing ourselves and our world in altered ways, and that has immense therapeutic benefits. And I'm not saying this lightly. We have already looked at some of the research data, especially from the Johns Hopkins Center for Psychedelics and Consciousness. And I think that slide is right there. And we also know that when we ingest psilocybin and when it converts into psilocin in our body, it particularly interacts with our default mode network, the network regions in our brain responsible for our sense of self, and in fact it reduces its activity, and we can clearly identify them through certain fMRI interpretations. So I will be sharing some of that in the upcoming sessions as well. And we know that this state is really special because uh, during this state our brain globally connects. What I mean by globally connects, usually our brain, our nervous system has a specific way of connecting with different elements. However, when we have ingested psilocybin and while it's active in our body, our brain is able to surpass certain barriers and interconnect with uh, different parts communicating to each other, especially parts that usually don't communicate with each other. So it's a state of neural plasticity, we call it. Neural plasticity is heightened connections, which enables us to learn, unlearn, relearn, reorganize, and create new neural paths, which means it influences how we behave, how we think, how we feel, and how we perceive the world as well. So we discussed a little bit of mechanisms around psilocybin in our previous sessions, and one of them was to recognize how it enables us to look at ourselves beyond what we have created as our sense of self. We have a very strong sense of self. Very often we also use the word ego. And usually when we look at ourselves in the mirror, what we see is this constructed image. However, when we consume a psychedelic substance like psilocybin, and when we look at ourselves, we notice that the familiarity breaks down. When familiarity breaks down, we start to see ourselves from different perspectives, and it can be extremely powerful when we look at it from an introspective lens. And not only that, we are able to look at ourselves without that strong ego oriented sense of self oriented way of looking at ourselves. We also are able to create larger possibilities. Sometimes we call them mystical experiences or metaphysical experiences. These experiences can be quite abstract. At the same time, when we reflect and when we try to make meaning, very often we are able to understand so much more than what we usually, with our usual cognition. And this image is something that I keep bringing back to this session, as we have discussed how this experience, personally for me, connected myself to the entire universe, uh, enabling me to really dissolve my sense of self and recognize if this constructed sense of self, my sense of self with different elements that I believe who I am, that poses a very powerful question. If I am not, if I can go beyond, or if I can look beyond who I have come to believe based on my body, the time that I am part of, my own awareness, my emotions, especially identity and associations, it poses a very powerful question. So then, who are you really? And that's when I came to this image, connecting me with the entire universe in my limited language, limited way of being able to explain that experience. And this is not just a isolated experience. Many uh, people, those who go through this kind of psychedelic experiences, often also go through similar experiences. So insight, maybe their experience is different, but the insight is similar. And very often we call it oneness. So let's continue on. So this is where we are at the moment. So we also have come to learn that very often in our how we are usually is a construct of our existing neural networks, and they are like hardened parts on a snowfall. But what psychedelic medicines enable is for us to step back and look at the bigger picture. And instead of being limited to those pre-existing parts, to move beyond and to be able to create those parts that would truly serve us, that would enable our transformation. And as I mentioned earlier, we have looked at some of this, the research, and we have looked at some of the data, and we clearly noticed that the possibility, the therapeutic possibility is immense with uh, the when we apply psychedelics in the right set and setting with the proper preparation process and an integration process. So let's continue on and dive into the session today. Okay, mind altering medicines. Mind altering medicines. And I'd like to use the word medicines because they have healing powers. They are able to address root causes. These medicines are capable of both creating cognitive, body focused, if not somatic focused, energetic focused healing. Sometimes it is understood, it can be processed, it can become cognitive. That's one type of transformation or healing. On the other hand side, sometimes there's also spontaneous healing. We do not even know, we did not even think, we did not even expect, we did not even prepare, but some healing become possible as you go through a safe journey with psychedelics. So I would like to call these substances as medicines to begin with. But at the same time, let's dive in and try to understand it from a scientific perspective, looking at also the standard terminology so that we align ourselves universally. Excuse me. So when we look at the when we say mind-altering substances, the scientific term is psychoactive substances. Psychoactive substances. So what are psychoactive? What is psychoactive? What are psychoactive substances? When these substances are introduced to our body, they affect our mental processes such as perception, consciousness, cognition, mood, emotion, behavior, energy, relational aspects, how we relate to ourselves, how we relate to our outer world, our existential perspectives, our spiritual understanding, and so on. So it enables us to change our perception. It changes the mental processes. It changes the way how we experience emotion, how inhibited we are in terms of maybe approaching someone, or whether we can be less inhibited, and so on. So there are so many different types of psychoactive substances. So we put all of them into one container and call them psychoactive substances to begin with. And when we think about psychoactive substances from a scientific perspective, we approach them from two sides. One side is pharmacological function. In simple terms, when the chemistry, if not the substance, the molecules interact with our body, what happens? What does it do to our body? That is pharmacological function. How does it impact our nervous system? How does it interact with our nervous system? And when it comes to the other type of looking at psychoactive substance is to look at them through the lens of subjective experience. What does the person feel? And often these substances, psychoactive substances, have similarities in terms of subjective experience. So today we are going to comparison. We are going to focus on pharmacological function. At the same time, also understand as the body is interacting with these psychoactive substances, what is our subjective experience? How does the person feel? How does the person um, process, relate? Right, so let's dive in. There are few key categories that I would like to introduce to you. So there are depressants, stimulants, opioids, if not narcotics, dissociatives, and psychedelics. So let's look at these five key categories of psychedelic substances. So we are going to focus on these five different types of psychoactive substances to begin with. Because you may notice very often when we hear about psychedelics, depressants, stimulants, uh, we very often we misuse either in the legal context or in the general context. Often these substances are categorized under narcotics. Very often it's misunderstood. But in fact, scientific perspective, it's only the opioids that we really consider as narcotics. The other substances have their own category, which you are looking at right now. So moving on, let's begin with depressants. Now, when we talk about depressants, let's look at some of the examples. Alcohol and then something like benzodiazepines are considered as depressants. Now, when we talk about benzodiazepines, you may have heard about maybe the more common term, which is Xanax. It's a type of benzodiazepines which we call alprazolam. So these are depressants. So what is a depressant? Alcohol, and if Xanax, alcohol, they are depressants. What do they do? Simply, they reduce the neural activity. So you immediately recognize that. Then if we consider alcohol, for an example, as a narcotic or psychoactive substance, it's immediately different from what psychedelics do, right? It does, like we already know now, the psychedelics increase the neural activity, whereas depressants reduce the neural activity. What does it really do? It decreases the arousal, it slow down the cognition, so in the thinking processes, reduce psychological activation, and very often this has a sedation impact of sedation, effects of sedation, mild relaxation to sedation, impaired coordination, loss of consciousness at higher doses. And that's why we have seen sometimes when people have taken too much to drink, alcohol in this case, they might black out, right? The sedation. And then if you look at some of the key effects, if you look at the physical key effects, we understand it impairs coordination and it creates drowsiness. And that's why obviously after alcohol, we don't drive. And if you look at the emotions aspects, it enables relaxation because when the neural activity is increased, that means the thinking process is highly active. But when we take depressants, what happens? It enables a reduction of the neural activity. So relaxation starts to, now we experience relaxation. With that comes reduced anxiety. The more we think, the more we process, the higher our anxiety could go. But when the neural activity is reduced, automatically we feel less anxiety. And also, at the same time, however, it blunts emotions. The connection between different parts of the brain. For an example, the cerebral cortex, the outer layer of the brain, the gray matter, connecting with the limbic system, for an example, the emotional processing area, this connection reduces because of the reduced neural activity. Therefore, it it uh, it creates a state of emotional bluntness. And if you look at the cognitive aspects or the mental aspects, the thinking aspects, processing aspects, often slow thinking, impaired judgment, and reduced attention. And we know this very well as we have either experienced consuming alcohol or we have noticed, we have observed someone. In terms of behavior, disinhibition, because we are not we are not so inhibited because our brain is not processing too much. Our amygdala is not processing so much fight and flight response. We are not too critical about ourselves because of the reduced neural activity. Therefore, we are less inhibited. And that's why sometimes people end up taking risks, like engaging in risk-taking behavior. And at the same time, however, although we engage in risk-taking behavior, we may be inhibited actually to perform them because of the reduced motor control. When the neural activities are reduced, the way how we balance ourselves, the way how we move around also changes. And that's why very often we see people who take sometimes certain um, um, medicines like alprazolam, their motor control slows down. They very often say they don't fully feel like themselves. And we also see people after consuming a considerable amount of alcohol, they tend to lose balance, for an example. So I think it becomes clear to us understanding what a depressant is, and then you are immediately recognizing that depressants are clearly different from psychedelics. So alcohol, for that matter, is not the effect is not similar to psychedelics at all. Very often, people who have had sometimes um, maybe challenging experiences with alcohol, the tipsiness, right? We call it sometimes in layman's terms. This kind of experience makes someone feel afraid that they might go into some similar experience like that. But we notice that that's not the case because the function itself is different within our nervous system. Depressants, right? So then let's move on to stimulants. Now, to look at some of the stimulants, we know that stimulants stimulate us. So, some of the examples we can think about are nicotine, caffeine, and some of the other drugs as well. So, if we simply look at what a stimulant does is, in that case, you would imagine that actually it increases central nervous system activity. Yet again, it's different from psychedelics if you noticed. When we talk about psychedelics, especially the classic hallucinogenic substances like psilocybin, which we have been discussing so far, you may recall that the psychedelics directly interacts with serotonergic system. And here, if you look at the stimulants, it directly interacts with central nervous system, increases the central nervous system's activity. It enhances alertness, energy, and attention. Along with that, usually people experience improved focus, wakefulness, overstimulation, and in certain conditions, anxiety and psychological strain. I think a simple example, since many of us have had coffee, I think at some point in our life, caffeine in that case, and also at some point we may have taken a little bit of more caffeine than we need. We have experienced that anxiety. We may have experienced that psychological strain can come in many different forms. For an example, let's say restlessness. Therefore, I think we gain an understanding that the stimulants are again different from depressants, different from psychedelics. It has a very different function. They interact with different parts of our nervous system. And what are some of the physical changes that can happen? Increased heart rate, elevated blood pressure, reduced appetite very often, and then also restlessness, if you noticed. Emotional aspects, often some of these stimulants, I think perhaps nicotine and caffeine may have less of these effects. But if you look at something like cocaine, you notice that there's tendency for euphoria, confidence, in some cases. At the same time, there also could be irritability, anxiety, especially with higher doses. And I think we do not necessarily need to talk about those stronger drugs, stronger substances. But if you simply come to think about consuming caffeine, you know that could make one anxious and restless. And also, until the effects wear off, sometimes a person could become even very fearful. And if you look at some of the mental functions, the heightened focus, faster thinking, increased alertness, it prepares us to be alert. So that also makes sense. If we are alert, strongly alert, if there was in the environment or for some reason, if there was some kind of a stimuli that makes us fearful, so the uh, anxiety could be expanded further. And if you look at the behaviors, usually increased activity, talkativeness, compulsive patterns. And compulsive patterns here also indicates that that we could become very easily dependent on these substances, especially the stimulants. And many of us sometimes say, I need a coffee, my brain is not working. I need to go for a smoke before I would be able to address this. Very often we hear this kind of day-to-day sayings because we are noticing that it's a stimulant. It alerts us so that we can perform better while we are stimulated. So the stimulants. Now let's move on to the next segment. Opioids. Opioids are if you have questions, please feel free to send them in the chat room and I will have a look very soon. All right. So opioids are the true narcotics, scientific form. Opioids are the ones considered as narcotics. So for some example, we can think about morphine, heroin, and these are very strong drugs that we very often hear being discussed when it comes to drug-related topics. So what do narcotics really do? They create a profound sedation in our body. It directly work with our endorphin systems, opioid systems, where they create reducing the perception of pain. This is the key area of narcotics effect. So often it reduces pain and it creates it creates a sense of euphoria when we it reduces pain and increases the euphoric feeling in our body. Therefore, it directly, strongly affect our reward and pain regulation systems, increases the reward systems and reduces the pain regulation systems. So our body goes into a state of euphoria. So this is why, therefore, of course, you would imagine any substance that is directly attached to our reward mechanisms, reward systems, usually have a tendency of um, dependency, therefore abuse. And that's why the word narcotics are very often used with addiction, dependency, abuse, misuse, and so on. So then, based on this quick exploration, I think you're already starting to recognize that pain relief, slowed breathing, drowsiness, constipation, for that matter, are some of the physical effects of narcotics. And then, in terms of emotional experience, often it's euphoria, warmth, and emotional numbing, however. Because once again, when the pain regulation system is downplayed, there's the element of emotional numbing. And also sometimes individuals, especially people, those who have had traumatic experiences, the trauma responses, if not challenges due to their past experiences. So as you're aware, friends, you know that I'm also conducting a session about trauma. Therefore, I do not address so much about trauma in these sessions because we go really in depth with our trauma sessions. Therefore, I invite you to join those sessions. In combination of these two lecture series, I think would bring you to a greater, higher understanding of how powerful the therapeutic potential of these psychedelic medicines towards healing trauma, adversities, and some of the challenges that we are experiencing in a day-to-day life. Now, when we have had challenging experiences, maybe traumatic experiences, stressor-related concerns, they involve our emotion. They magnify emotions, especially those emotions that might be uh, difficult to regulate, difficult to certain emotions that may be challenging. So when we take narcotics, what happens is because of the reduction of the pain regulation and increase of the reward systems, often we are not so much present to the emotion itself. So there is a numbing effect when it comes to emotions. And then when we look at cognition, also because we are not in a alert state, unlike the stimulants, you will notice our thinking is clouded and the awareness is reduced and we slow down mentally. And very often, I believe, when someone is interested in undertaking a psychedelic healing journey, when the because of not having a very good, clear understanding of what these different narcotics do, or different types of psychoactive substances do, we mix up these different reactions, different effects. Therefore, we sometimes uh, we may have end up confusing what psychedelics could do while other psychoactive substance, with the mixing up understanding of effects of different psychedelic compounds. So you are starting to recognize already how important it is for us to clearly understand the difference between these psychoactive substances so that you know why psychedelics stand out and their therapeutic possibility, therapeutic potential. Uh, Next one, mental cognitive functioning, clouded thinking, mental slowing down, as we discussed. When it comes to behavior, withdrawal from activity. Usually, people who take narcotics are not stimulated to engage in meaningful activities. It is something that people prefer to really relax and then potentially be in that euphoric state. And also, it reduces our responsiveness. We are not as alert. We are not able to respond to certain stimuli in our environment. For an example, danger. As I mentioned earlier, when there's a system, especially the reward system is activated, there's a very high level of dependency. Now, when we say dependency, there are different types of dependency. I would like to address two key types of dependency. One type of dependency is the physiological dependency. That means something changes in our body. Something changes in our body, and this change most of the time are specific neurochemical receptors. Now we know 5-HT2A receptors, which are the serotonin receptors. For an example, I might have mentioned this earlier. When we take antidepressants, in the long run, what antidepressants do is lock in more neurochemicals in our nervous system to create a induced regulated state. Induced regulated state. That means the serotonin receptors keep on binding with the synthetically managed neurochemical release. So in the long run, the serotonin receptors learn because our body is extremely intelligent. The receptors learn why is uh, why is it not natural for the serotonin reuptake to take place? In other words, being absorbed back into the system. So what it does is, as an intelligent system, it starts to reduce the serotonin receptors in our between two neurons. So in that case, we call it a synaptic cleft. So you're noticing that when we say that we are physiologically dependent, it truly means something in our body physiologically, quite literally, changes. That's one type of dependency. So that you would notice that dependency is going to physiologically affect us. So that means let's say if someone is dependent on alcohol or nicotine for that matter, they need that stimulant all the time. And when the stimulant isn't present, the body, because of now body has changed its physiological structure, in this case, neurological structure. Therefore, the body is unable to function in its optimum state. So it goes into a state of withdrawal, right? It goes into a state of withdrawal. And that's what we call withdrawal symptoms. Like for an example, if we talk about alcohol context, alcohol withdrawal delirium, we call it AWD, directly affects the NMDA receptors. You do not need to know these names. I know that some of the colleagues who are here are advanced practitioners. So these little nuggets are for you to continue to think about them. And if you are simply here because you are interested in the subject, do not be concerned about any of these scientific terms, just to give you an idea. So there's also the dependency can be developed when we intake narcotics. All right. And disassociatives. Let's look at disassociatives. And I think one of the most common ones potentially we are hearing these days is ketamine. Ketamine is, you already know that ketamine also creates a very sedated state, and very often ketamine used to be used with animals like horses. And we also know, of course, ketamine can also be taken in many different ways into human body as well, and also has a specific functioning. So for an example, it disrupts normal integration of sensory perception. That's one of the first things that happens with ketamine. So it also disrupts memory and even our identity. It's a disassociative, which truly means here is that it detach ourselves from self and our environment. Self and our environment. And as a result, it creates this profound separation from ourselves. So sometimes individuals are even able to experience something like out of body experiences. I think earlier we already discussed about out of body experiences. So you have some understanding of what that really means. Now, now when we talk about ketamine, uh, ketamine could be taken for these effects, this profound disassociation. Like for an example, let's say when a person is struggling with a specific emotion due to maybe a past experience or maybe a current ongoing stressor related concern, if they are able to disassociate from that specific experience or that specific memory or that specific um, emotion that they're experiencing, they may have a temporary um, release or um, temporary relief. I think that's the word. So therefore, we notice that why people tend to use it. Now, at the same time, beyond that, if you look at it also from a therapeutic lens, you notice that ketamine is also mentioned as a psychedelic very often. But if you really come to think of it, it's actually dissociative uh, compound, if not a substance. But at the same time, it has a very strong therapeutic possibility as well. What do I mean by that? Now imagine if you look at the some of the effects of it. Let's look at the effects first. The numbness, reduced pain perception. Look at those, right? Emotional detachment, and euphoria, disconnection from reality, identity and perception. If you look at some of those key effects, think about someone who has been through a very traumatic experience. There are flashbacks. They are unable to process the emotion coming through as they recall this experience. And maybe when the certain triggers are uh, present in their environment, they may become re-triggered and they might re-experience that traumatic experience, or they might go into a space that is hard to regulate, hard to process. So if you are able to create a state that has a reduced pain perception, disconnection from reality, altered identity perception, you notice that they may be able to re-look at that traumatic experience. They may be able to process that experience from a detached perspective, from a place of disassociation, so that enabling them to reprocess that experience, for them to enable new neural connections and create potentially a higher understanding, looking at the bigger picture of what may have happened to them. Therefore, potentially coming to terms with it, understanding that situation, not relating to themselves so much, looking at it from less involved sense of self. Therefore, you notice that that the reason why ketamine could be used as a medicine, if not a way of working with trauma. So we notice that ketamine therapy is available around the world. In many places, it's legal. The reason being, it actually has therapeutic potential as well. While there are also potential for it to abuse dependency, at the same time, it also can be used therapeutically as well. So I think it becomes clear. And at the same time, of course, when we look at the effects, there are also certain negative consequences as well. So for an example, impaired motor coordination and blunt effect, and also the confusion that it could create, the withdrawal from the real world, and sometimes unusual movement, reduced responsiveness. So we are noticing that the different categories of psychoactive compounds have different effects, becoming very clear. Now we are looking at 5 different compounds, and now we are coming to our the discussion here, which is the psychedelics. So now we are going to look at the classic hallucinogenics. Now, in a minute, I will discuss further a little bit into what classic hallucinogenic gens are. For now, let's remember what it does. We remember now, since we have been discussing about psilocybin for a while, you notice that it creates altered perception, cognition, consciousness, often producing profound changes in how individuals experience reality. These changes could be ranging from visual experiences to auditory experiences to deep introspective experiences to transcendental experiences to relational experiences to trauma related aspects, and so on. The alteredness can help us with these different experiences. And you're starting to notice that the description itself is different from other psychoactive compounds that we have been looking at. So if you look at the key effects, so what are some of the classic psychedelic substances? Psilocybin, the magic mushrooms that we are talking about here, LSD, and then mescaline, DMT. So you see some of the imagery here. When we look at psilocybin is the magic mushrooms, and then we have LSD, which is lysergic acid diethylamide, which is a synthetic compound, which we will learn in a minute, in a few minutes who synthesized it. And then we will look at mescaline. Mescaline is the San Pedro or peyote cacti, and DMT is N-dimethyltryptamine. Now, when we also use the word psilocybin, if you may remember, the scientific term is 4-phosphoryloxy N-dimethyltryptamine. So you're starting to already see a little bit of a commonality between even the chemical compounds, if not the molecule structure. So we notice that when it comes to classic hallucinogenics, they are usually this dimethyltryptamine family of chemicals. So when we talk about DMT, you know the DMT comes, one of the ways of extracting DMT is using the ayahuasca brew, right? We know about ayahuasca. We have heard about ayahuasca, where we need certain roots and certain bark of the tree, and then we create a brew, and that releases DMT into the brew, and then we can ingest it. And also, I mentioned many times when we talk about serotonin receptors, you see the word 5-HT2A receptor. What does 5-H2 stand for? 5 dimethyl 5 dimethyltryptamine, right? So that's the receptor which binds with these serotonin receptors. So you are starting to recognize the hallucinogenic, especially the psychedelics, are related to the serotonergic system, the regulatory aspects of our body. So let's look at some of the key effects of it. The physical effects, the dilated pupils, increased heart rate, and sensory sensitivity. Usually during psychedelic experience, we could become very sensitive to our sensory experience. So when we go into a controlled psychedelic experience with the right set and setting, there are specific ways how we manage sensory sensitivity. To give you an example, when our heart rate is increased, naturally, the when our perception cognition changes, our brain, our nervous system starts consuming more energy. That means more blood needs to travel to our body. So the increasing of heart rate is very understandable. When the heart rate is increased, and the body is consuming more energy, you notice that it will immediately affect the temperature of the body, right? Because in order for the body to remain at a specific optimum temperature, it also requires energy. So you are starting to recognize, if you are going to a psychedelic experience, even regulating the body temperature is important. Be it whether you are in a cold environment, whether you are in a warm environment, whether you would be needing a fan, or whether you would be needing an air conditioner, or whether you would be needing a um, heater for that matter. All that matters. So when you work with a psychedelic integration practitioner who is educated, they know how to enable this right environment for you, even the bodily conditions. That's just one aspect, that just the temperature. So you would imagine that there are other sensory experiences. And now another thing that I would like to mention, very often individuals tend to have a playlist listen to. That means it's impacting them. What they are listening to is impacting them. If they had a playlist, and if they're in a controlled environment, that could be helpful. But imagine if someone is in a party setting, a space that we cannot control. People will maybe other people are consuming other types of certain substances, be it alcohol, be it certain stronger drugs. And then when we are in an environment like this, we won't be able to control our sensory experiences. That means maybe loud noises, maybe physical touch, maybe what we see. We are not in a way of we are not able to fully be in control, if not manage those experiences. So often we hear sometimes psychedelics being associated with uh, party settings, and you're immediately starting to realize that those are not the right settings, not the set and setting for psychedelic experiences. And in fact, when people talk about their bad experiences, most of the time when people explain to me about their bad experiences, one of the things that we find out about them is that they did this in a space that they were not able to control their sensitivity. They were not able to control the environment. Something happened to them, and that sent them down a spiral, if not a rabbit hole. What are some of the emotional changes? Heightened emotions, right? So our brain, if you may recall that two diagrams we looked at earlier, one side being our placebo brain, if not the brain in the normal state, and then also this hyperconnected state of the brain. That means we are able to experience more, we are able to process more emotions. And also, whichever the emotion shows up is what is going to expand, which means if you are in a party setting or if you are in a setting that is not suitable for a psychedelic experience, if there was an external stimuli or a trigger and we were not provided the right care, right setting, that specific emotion could maximize, that could expand, and we might go down in that rabbit hole, as I mentioned earlier. That's the main important reason why that there's a preparation protocol. You prepare for 6 weeks to at least 3 months before you go into a psychedelic experience. And the day of the ceremony, if not the time that you engage in the ceremony, your practitioner is required to walk you through certain specific structured steps in order for you to be in a grounded, safe, emotionally, mentally, physiologically, energetically grounded space, and bring the right intentions, bring the right emotions to the surface so that we can expand them and we can maximize the power and the value of them. So, sorry, apart from mixing up the effects of different psychoactive compounds, this also may be one of the reasons why sometimes people are a bit fearful about psychedelics. The reason being that maybe we have heard stories, bad stories, maybe we didn't fully understand the context of it. Now, myself having conducted numerous hundreds of ceremonies, I can guarantee you there was not a moment one would come out and say that it was a bad experience or that specific emotion, the expanded state was not valuable to me and it was, in fact, not serving me. There had been challenging experience, that is a given. But at the same time, it was therapeutic, it was healing for them to go through that challenging experience. Challenging experiences, just to give an example for an instance, sometimes people recall certain things that they were not able to recall earlier. This might be related to a specific adversity. This may be related to a specific trauma that they had. Sometimes certain traumatic experiences sit within our nervous system without cognitively being able to be connected directly that I'm having these challenges in life because of that traumatic experience. Maybe there was amnesia around this experience, amnesia around this traumatic experience. For an example, I had a client who was not able to recall. They have had a physical accident where a large rock fell on this client, and their shoulder was severely damaged. In fact, all the brachial flexes, if not the nervous connection, the neuronal connections from the shoulder to the hand were damaged. And this person was not able to recall this experience. The person remembers climbing the mountain with the fellow climbers and blackout. Wake up in the hospital bed, ask what happened to me. And the wife explains, and he go like, really? And then fall back into blackout or some kind of amnesia, come back again. What happened to me? So repeatedly. And even at the time this client is coming to see me for for a few sessions, they were not able to actually recall that experience and reprocess that experience. So you would imagine when they recall that experience, it was a challenging experience for them. It was difficult, but what is important is having the right care, right support during that experience, having well prepared them for that moment so that they can mitigate any challenge and really use that for their healing purposes. So the emotions can become heightened. That's the reason why it's very important that when we approach psychedelic experiences, that we do not do them if we do not have someone who is guiding us through that process, especially if they are your very first experiences, especially if you're someone who is vulnerable, especially someone who has had challenges, difficulties, traumatic experiences. Even if you believe that you do not have such experiences, it is still absolutely very important and highly important that um, you go through that process in a systematic way so that you're prepared for that moment. And if you look at some of the potential, sometimes people go into an awe. They end up experiencing, like I mentioned earlier, when I noticed that I'm connected to the entire universe. I remember, I think I mentioned earlier, uh, for a lack of a better way of explaining, during my first psychedelic experience, it felt like the gates of the heaven opened. It's not that I have a belief about heaven either now or at the time, but that's the only language that I could use to explain to you what that experience is like in metaphorically. And being feeling of connected to the entire universe, to entire all of you, all the plants, all the trees, and all the oceans. It's such an experience that one goes into such awe because it's so powerful. It's bigger than you in many cases. At the same time, if the set and setting is not accurate, correct, anxiety, fear can also occur during psychedelic experiences. Mental wise, so we have altered perception of ourselves, our environment, and even time itself and space itself. We sometimes experience the space that we are in differently. And often the power of psychedelics is the enhanced introspection. Now, I must be very clear when I share this with you. Now, there's a different range of psychedelic experiences. Very often, why some people are afraid of psychedelic experiences is because their understanding of psychedelic experience is such that they believe that they have to take a macro dose, in other words, a stronger dose to go into these experiences. Well, if you are expecting to have a ego dissolution experience, the reduction of your sense of self, your default mode network, experience this oneness, connectedness, or dissolving your sense of self, it is recommended to go between an optimum dose to a macro dose. However, these are not the only therapeutic doses when it comes to engaging with psychedelics. So, for an example, the program that I teach, our practitioners very clearly understand that you could even enable the client's introspection with a simple microdose, which is about 10 to 15 times smaller than the optimum dose one would take to experience ego dissolution. And that a person may not experience any altered perception as such. They may not experience a mental, emotional, or even physiological alteredness at all. Nevertheless, even with a simple microdose, they still could become highly introspective. I know that some of you are professional coaches, healers, psychotherapists, educators, and so on in this space. And imagine a state that you are trying to think, become creative, make connections. And some days it works really well, and some days it's not the case. Now, when you have taken a microdose, do you know that the creativity can grow? The introspection can become powerful. So even with a microdose, where there is no effect at all except for this ability to connect without physiological, without emotional, without direct altered state as such, we still could create a valuable state. And how psychedelic, especially uh, if you have some level of concern experiencing psychedelic medicine, it's very, if you have or even if you don't have any concern, it's always advisable starting with a microdose and then increasing it maybe 3 or 5 times of the microdose, and then maybe increasing it into a, let's say, what we call a recreational dose, and then moving towards more of an optimal dose, which can be helpful for ego dissolution. So when you do that, gradually you are introducing into your body these experiences, and then also this altered state of consciousness is gradually experienced. So when you hear psychedelic integration practitioners, when you meet them or when you talk to them, if someone says you would come and you will experience optimum to macrodose, I think that might not be necessarily the best way to approach it. So the educated, trained practitioners are aware the importance of building up towards the macro doses, if not optimum doses, because that way our body becomes familiar, our emotion, mind becomes familiar. So you would imagine the kind of harm it could bring to us if we consumed a large amount of psychedelics in a party setting or in an unsafe setting. So this is important to understand. Once again, every psychoactive substance, depending on how much we consume, in other words, the dose is what determines what our experience is going to be like. And then if you look at some of the behavioral changes, reduced external focus, usually during psychedelic experiences, there are many different types of psychedelic experiences, especially guided experiences. If you're moving more towards the shamanic experiences, more psychedelic facilitated experiences, the possibility is that you arrive that day in the morning most of the time or the day before, and then you receive your medicine pretty quickly, that either day after or immediately after receiving. And then there is sometimes ritualistic dancing, playing music, um, and different types of rituals. It could include many different things. Drumming, humming, playing musical instruments, a lot of things can happen. Can this be therapeutic? Can this be valuable? Yes, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. They can be extremely powerful. They can be extremely valuable. But at the same time, the idea is to reduce those vibrational external focus, because we are usually externally focused most of the time. Even our peripheral vision, our peripheral senses are always scanning our environment to see whether we are safe or not. So we are very often externally focused. What is most valuable in a psychedelic experience is to go deeper. So when you consider a balanced experience, neither too clinical nor too shamanic, when you find a fine balance, the idea is really to invite yourself inward. Instead of external focus, bring your attention inward. So inviting into the inward reflection, because that's where the therapeutic potential is. So inward reflect. And also the responses can be unpredictable. Like I said earlier, what do we mean by that? One might experience multiple colors. One might experience something very organic that is familiar to this earth, familiar to our world, familiar to this realm that we live in. You might experience something very organic, very organic, like maybe something to do with plants, something to do with animals, something like that. Um, and at the same time, someone else might experience something very different. Instead of seeing colors, they might not experience colors at all. They might experience insights. Instead of experiencing something so organic, they might end up experiencing something very alienish, something that we cannot express using our human languages. Maybe um, like for me, like how I would like to explain it is in some psychedelic experiences, sessions, I have experienced something almost like a code underneath of us. It's almost like a program, but it's the source code. It's the like another way. So if that doesn't make much sense, I would say it like this. Um, if you were ever able to experience or touch the walls of your, not the brain, your mind, what would be that like? Very abstract, you would think. Indeed, there had been times that I am moving in this specific, this experience, altered state of consciousness experience. I come across my own mind. It's almost like a mirror. I hit myself. It's a very abstract experience. So sometimes it can be very abstract, sometimes it can be very organic, sometimes it can be very alien-like. Very different experiences, extremely unpredictable. Person to person, it's unpredictable. Session to session, it's unpredictable. It's most of the time not the same experience. Nevertheless, however, sometimes individuals also report similar experiences, like for an example, oneness I mentioned. People feeling connected to the entire universe, people becoming nothingness, people experiencing dissolving themselves into nothingness. Once I remember experiencing being in the middle of the universe, floating myself. I would say floating myself is that sensory experience like a float, but really what I mean by float is not having any weight. Weight also doesn't necessarily mean the physical weight. The weight is the weight of the emotion, weight of the cognition, weight of the behavior, weight of the relations, weight of the spirituality, weight of everything. What if you were able to release yourself from all that weight? What if you were in a gigantic space that has no ending, but you are floating there because you're so light, right? So the experiences are truly varied. Every time I speak to a client, it's so mesmerizing to hear their story. Recently, during one of our recent psychedelic retreats, one of the clients, I think I mentioned, experienced a light energy coming through her head, all the way reaching into her womb, because this client was focusing on a specific womb healing aspect. And that client particularly found out that specific healing. Likewise, there are many different experiences, and I'd like to share with you a little bit of story about my father at this point of time. So, my father was, um, you know, my history a little bit as I'm sharing them in these sessions, as well as I'm sharing those stories in my trauma-informed trauma-informed lecture series, Trauma Informs Love. So my father was dissociated from us very much, because my mom was this person who was struggling with many mental disorders that she wasn't aware of, very absolutely chaotic. One day, our mother is loving, caring, nurturing person. She will take her heart out to support us. And on some days, she's unrecognizable. She's someone else. She's not inside of this body that she used to live in. And my father, for that matter, growing up as one of the youngest among the siblings, as one of the, I think the one before the youngest, having of six children, having received very little attention, having really cared for, nurtured for as a child, not having cared as a child, not having uh, received love and care in a specific way, he didn't know how to really process his emotions. So when my mom became chaotic, when my mom was not able to um, be in her full senses, our father would just drive away, and he would resort to um, alcohol. And some days he will not come back. So this is my father. This is my father. For a very long period of time, he was bottling up all of this emotion. I also believe, as much as myself and my sister uh, endured many traumatic experiences through what my mom was going through, very reasonably understanding considering her background, my father was also traumatized in many ways based on our experiences. Therefore, for a very long period of time, he was bottling emotion. He was bottling his emotion. And by the time he was, let me tell you exact number, around 67 years old, 66 or 66 years old, when my father developed anxiety. And he was experiencing depression and anxiety for a very long time. And then at the same time, uh, diabetes, many other conditions. So, what was affected the most is his heart, the place that we refer to immediately when we talk about love. It was very clear, and it is very clear even to date, that my father's only one and only love is my mother. It was very clear. And it was very clear when his heart became blocked, quite literally. The blockages in emotion, the blockages in love, the blockages in coming together as a family manifested in his heart. So four valves in his heart were blocked, and the medical doctors told us that either the only way that he will potentially survive is through an open heart surgery. So when this happened, when we asked the doctors what is his probability of surviving, they would say 50-50. 50-50. And this is a devastating news for us. I think at his age of 66, he's still very young and he has a life to live. And my mom has just begun to heal her own trauma and to really enjoy life and them coming together. But his heart was literally blocked. So um, we had a family discussion, internal discussion, and very consciously we decided not to go towards. We did all pros and con analysis. We spoke to medical professionals. I spoke to my mentors. I spoke to several psychiatrists, several medical doctors, and then we decided not to go ahead with the open heart surgery. Instead, we decided we will walk him through the psychedelic integration protocol. And I was very confident that his heart is still experiencing the trauma, and that's the blockage about. It's the energetic blockage, it's the emotional blockage, not just only the physical symptoms. So I started preparing him, and it was his last resort, because he knew that if he went into with the diabetes and all the other severe conditions that he had, that him being alive today could have been impossible if he went into the surgery. Therefore, he decided to face his worries, face his emotion, and face all that blockages. So Lux and myself, we started preparing our dad for some time. And I remember the day of the ceremony. Now we are talking about coming from a place of experiencing different things during a psychedelic experience. And when he went into the psychedelic experience, he grew up in a Christian environment, so he believed in Jesus, that specific belief system his belief system is conditioned in that sense. So I remember him saying when he came out of the experience, once he went through that deep psychedelic experience, he said that there was an opening. This opening was like a waterfall, and this waterfall, the water was golden. It's a a golden waterfall started right before him. And as he was observing the waterfall, baby Jesus rose and extended arm towards him. Please bear with me. And he fell asleep. In the experience, he thought he fell asleep. And that was all about it. That was all his experience. My father is not someone who is um express himself artistically. It's not someone who is comfortable experiencing emotion um, as such. So that was his experience. This golden waterfall, baby Jesus rising and extending her arm towards him. And to cut the story short, 3 months later, we go to the same doctor. Of course, the integration process, 3 months of integration process. And he's feeling healthier. He started to lose weight. He stopped drinking alcohol. And he we started to see that he did not have all those challenges that he had, including anxiety and depression. 3 months later, he was cooking. He loves cooking. He prepares food for my mom. That's one of his favorite things. He takes care of the garden. So we saw that sitting in the bed and just either focusing on TV or just blankly looking into something. From that, he moved into started cooking again, stopped drinking alcohol, started gardening again. So we knew something was shifting, but we were too afraid even to really bring him back to the medical doctor. And when we brought him back, and then when they did the tests again, the first question was, how did this happen? What did you guys do? The four blockages were gone. And I think that was a moment we collectively started healing as family. So I'm bringing them to Thailand in just a month, and we are very excited to be together and spend time together. And I don't remember any time in our childhood we had such memories. Now I'm 42 years old, and my father is 70 plus, my mom is 60 plus. Finally, we have found the love to come together. So if you ask me, why am I doing these sessions? Why am I continuing to learn and grow this practice, help other people? It's because it has absolutely changed my life, and it has changed my family, and it has changed my clients. I have such conviction in the power of possibilities these medicines enable. So that's why I'm in front of you today, and that's why I'm sharing this story with you. I hope this story doesn't bring any distress to you. I hope it inspires you. And I feel absolutely comfortable experiencing this emotion, but I wasn't expecting it just today. Nevertheless, so let's continue on. So people have very different experiences. Very often it is very subjective to who they are. their experiences. Like what we discussed earlier, Colton Brupo experienced Jesus himself. And then Anita Murjani experienced this pen torch where she could, where the lights of the entire warehouse of happiness, joy, and love came to light. So everyone's experience is very different. Very often, it also has a strong layer of their belief system, what they believe in, and what they know about themselves, what they know about the world. Regardless of those perceptual experiences, what happens in terms of the healing, what happens in terms of the transformation, that is the golden thread that we see at all times. So I want to share this message and let you know that if you're afraid, if you're worried, if you're concerned, it may be because of the misconceptions, maybe because not having the right understanding, or maybe you have not come across yet a place where you can be accompanied in a guided way, in a gradual process that you can experience psychedelics in a therapeutic setting. So the experiences are absolutely different, and they could create such awe if you have if you're doing it in the right set and setting. Now, some few important notes that we need to make about all these different psychoactive substances that we discussed about are um, oh, very soon we need to finish the session. Okay. Yeah, okay. So effects may vary significantly based on the dose, individual physiology, at the time their emotion, at the time their feelings, and the context, the set and setting. This is very important. Having the right preparation, right set and setting, quite literally, your practitioner who is around you, where you're doing this, what kind of temperature, whether you are wearing eye mask, whether you're putting on earplugs, all of that matters. And then as we notice that in some legal contexts, we use the word narcotics as a container for these psychoactive substances. And we know that um, now, after this session, you understand that there are different types of psychoactive substances and they have their own specific classifications and they do different things in your body. And then a key distinction that we need to keep in mind is all narcotics and psychedelics are psychoactive, if not mind altering substances. But not all psychoactive substances are narcotics or psychedelics. This is a very important distinction that we need to make because very often in the general language, legal systems, the word narcotics is used out of context, loosely or wrongly. So we keep that in mind. There are many different types of psychedelic categorizations. I'll just walk you through just the categorizations for today. And I think there's a little bit of this that I would discuss during our next session. There are three main categories when you look at the broader category. This is usually the class, the which part of body or our nervous system is interacting with psychedelics. So, for an example, if you look at the classic psychedelics, as I mentioned earlier, these are serotonergic system related psychedelics like psilocybin, LSD, and DMT. And then we have dissociatives, which are things like ketamine and PCP, for an example. And then we also have deliriants, which are atypical hallucinogenics, which means they do not interact the same way as how the other hallucinogenics react. Like, for an example, Amanita muscaria, the red color, the Mario mushroom, this works with aminobutyric systems in our body, the GABA system in our body, because these are aminobutyric acid related, for an example. That has sedation effect, which is very valuable for individuals with ADHD, for an example. Amanita muscaria, when it's properly processed, can be used as a management tool for people who have ADHD, for an example. So this is the broader category. And also there are different types of other categories. For an example, natural psychedelics. For an example, we talk about psilocybin, DMT, which comes from the plant, and then myo-DMT, which is 5-meo-DMT, which comes from the buffo toad, and then mescaline, for an example, from peyote and San Pedro cacti. And then there are also psychedelics by chemical family. I included them here for anyone's referral because you know that you can download these slides later. If you would like to dive deeper, here are some classic chemical classifications of psychedelics. Have a look, gain an understanding. And also I have included all the references for you here so that in case if you would like to continue to read more, when you download the slides, feel free to continue to learn more. So, as my very final invitation to you is come and join me during our next session. I will continue to elaborate and talk about the legalities, in which countries psychedelics are legal, in which countries it is decriminalized, and what are some new trends. I will also talk about the history of psychedelics. Why was psychedelics categorized under narcotics? For an example, war against drugs and how it has impacted for decades, how it has halted psychedelic research, and how the psychedelic research is now booming once again, and how the world is opening up to psychedelics in our next session. Beyond that, we will also discuss how particularly psilocybin, magic mushrooms, can be a therapeutic tool, the therapeutic potential beyond what we have discussed so far. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, I'm also doing a series around trauma, which is how trauma informs love. Our next session will focus on how the unconscious whispers from the past is quietly holding us back from our fullest life. Part three, very excited, and many individuals find this session also to be very valuable. So I invite you to come join me in combination. I believe this can be extremely valuable. And the next session is on the 11th May. With that, once again, thank you so very much. I would like to finish the session in time so that you can go about your day-to-day things. And in between, I will look at the questions and the sharings that you have sent in the chat, and I will incorporate answers in the future. I believe Lux, my sister, has shared with you the link to register for the certification, ongoing certification, and look forward to hearing your insights as well. With that, I send all of you love and light and look forward to seeing you in the next session or in one of those upcoming days. Thank you and bye for now.